Okay, so the title is Why Do I Have to Listen to the Rabbis? So hopefully I won't put myself out of business, and hopefully you'll still listen after this and not the opposite. And going along what Rav Skumik was saying, I feel like I'm preaching to the converted. I'm not trying to convince anyone and everything. I believe, we're all rabbinic Jews on whatever level that is for us. We're not Karaites. As far as I know, there's no one here who denies the validity of the oral tradition. They only believe in the written text, or even more extreme. I assume, rabbinic Judaism as we know it today is basically founded by the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Chachamim, who gave us in a written form the oral Torah that we've had all along when we received the written Torah. So I just want to lay some ground rules or ground facts for this presentation. So first of all, we're going to be covering a lot of ground, a lot of information, a lot of text. Some of it might be beyond some of where you're holding, but I'll try to explain it. And I recommend taking notes. You have a lot of marginal space on your page. You could kind of summarize each one of these sources in a few sentences, in a few words. Otherwise, it's just going to be like a giant block of text, and you're not really going to probably walk away with so much. And I also want to note that I feel and empathize with the irony of rabbis telling you that you have to listen to rabbis. And I don't even mean myself. Like, we're going to see that there are statements of Chazal telling you that you have to listen to Chazal. So, to me, it kind of reminds me of like a guy who's newly married, and he tells his wife, it says in the Rambam, you have to treat your husband like a king, and here's how you're going to serve me, and this is what you're going to do for me. Like, it's not so convincing. There's a little bit of perhaps bias in that situation. I assure you in these examples, there's no bias involved. These are all coming from legitimate sources.
It's being recorded?
It's being recorded, yeah. Fine. So, just want to clarify some things. So, we're going to be talking mostly about Chazal. Now, what does Chazal mean? Usually, Chazal is an acronym in case you didn't realize. It took me a long time to realize that the Arizal is an acronym. His name was the Ari, and Zal is just Zichrono Livracha. I thought his name was Arizal. So I don't know if I'm revealing this to you for the first time. So same thing, Chazal is actually an acronym for Chachamenu Zichrono Livracha. So I have the convention, I've noticed people aren't so makbid about this, I refer to Chazal in the plural, because it's referring to many people, even though it's a singular word. Okay, whatever, that's a semantical thing about English. But Chazal usually, different people refer to different things when they use the word Chazal. I've even seen the term Razal, the Rabbanim, Zichronim Livracha. But usually Chazal, in most, I think, Jewish texts, is referring specifically to the Chachamim of the Talmud, the Midrash, and the Gemara. So I'm going to be specifically mostly focusing on why do we have to listen to Chazal, the rabbis of the Mishnah and Talmud, but I'm going to expand it to why do we have to listen to Rabbanim in general, kind of going all the way up until today, and I believe the other classes tomorrow are going to delve into that also about the halachic process, which Rabbi Cohen's going to be speaking about, and Rabbi Schneider is also going to be speaking on the role of Gedolim and how do we relate to Gedolim, but we're going to be focusing more earlier on. Now, just to reach out to the audience. What do you believe Chazal do? What is their function? What are they? What is their job, so to speak? Transmit what?
The Torah, the oral Torah.
Right. Okay. Good. Yeah.
Jewish life.
Right. So they're going to be transmitting the Masorah that we received as an oral tradition from Sinai until their generation going forward. Okay. Good. And any other suggestions? Yeah.
I'm curious. What are the brackets of Chazal? Is Yehoshua part of Chazal? Who's
that's a good question. I guess you could include them. If you look in Pirkei Avos in the first Mishnah, it explains the whole chain from Moshe to Yehoshua to the Zikanim, Nevi'im, Zikanim. So, yes, technically speaking, those of you learning Beitza, the Gemara is making diukim from Yirmiyahu. Not everyone got to that page, but on Daf Yud Beis. So some of the Shirim saw that. So there's a pasuk in Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah the prophet, and the Gemara is making diukim as if he's a Mishnah. So technically speaking, they are part of Chazal, but I guess you don't see that oral Torah role as much in the written Torah because that's kind of the whole point of it. Yeah?
To generate/transmit
rabbinic, or I'll say to generate drushas first of all, to generate new svaras in the written text.
So basically, interpret psukim. I hear that. You started saying something else about rabbinic.
To transmit shlas to create rabbinic gedarim.
Right, exactly. So the way I see it, thank you. That's basically. What do you want to say?
I was also going to connect that. I'm under the impression that Chazal will find Torah sources for known oral Torah transmission.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Good. Very good. So the way I see it, Chazal, their job primarily is what's called Shtaim Shem Chamesh, 2 which are 5, which there's the oral biblical Torah that they're trying to give over, and then there's the rabbinic creations that they're kind of presenting for the first time. But that's really, I have here, maybe you could separate differently. I have about 5 different things. So there's, first of all, interpret psukim, which includes the Yugam Umidos, Torah Nedrashos Bahen, making drushos, finding sources for oral Torah laws in psukim. Also included in that is the Midrashim, which, explains kind of a bit about the background behind, there were these 3 men who came to Avraham. Who are these 3 men? They're really 3 malachim, that kind of stuff. 2 is transmit Masorah, which has absolutely no written counterpart. So, for example, Halachim Moshe Sinai, a lot of the details, halachos that we really don't have any source for. You're supposed to live in a sukkah. The Torah says to live in a sukkah for 7 days, but what's involved in living in a sukkah? First of all, what is a sukkah? So, is it my house? Can I build a sukkah, on top of an elephant? Can I build a sukkah on top of a boat? The Gemara talks about all these cases, and sometimes the Gemara brings drushos, brings Torah sources, but sometimes that's the Masorah, that's the tradition that they're giving over. So those are the 2 that are deraisa, that biblical, that they're giving over. And then there's 3 sort of rabbinic things that they do, which is they create enactments. For example, not this year, but in a few years, there's going to be Shemitah, and there's a rabbinic enactment called the Pruzbul, which is not our topic, but in Shemitah, all debts are canceled, and if you owe somebody money, so you technically don't owe them the money anymore when Shemitah hits. And there was a rabbinic enactment to do a loophole around the Torah called a Pruzbul, which kind of maintains the debts even on a Torah level. So that would be an enactment. We call that a takana, as opposed to what we call a gzera, a decree. So don't eat a fruit that fell off a tree, lest you go up to climb the tree and pluck the fruit yourself. So that's a gzera, that's a fence around the Torah. And then the third thing that they do is they kind of create new rabbinic concepts, rabbinic holidays. Hanukkah is the best example, that's really post-Tanakh, even if it's part of the non-Jewish Bible, but the Book of Maccabees is more like a historical book, but it's not part of the canon of Tanakh, so it's not part of the written Torah at all. And the whole concept was a later thing that the Gemara says was created by the Chachamim. The Chachamim made it, and therefore that's what they do. So those 3, again, 2 which are 5, biblical and rabbinic. The 2 biblical are in psukim, transmit the Masorah, and then the 3 that are rabbinic are tkanos, gezeros, and rabbinic mitzvahs, you can call it. The idea of brachos, that's probably the most common example of things that they created that we do all the time. There's a concept you're supposed to make 100 blessings every day, so really 1 or 2 of those are on a Torah level, benching, Birkat Hamazon, and maybe Birkat Torah, but the rest are all rabbinic concepts. So that's what Chazal do. Question?
Yeah, sorry. So I understand the 5 takanas and gezeros are 2 different categories in this.
I think so. One's like do something as opposed to don't do something. It's kind of like in a say and lo say, positive and negative. So takana is a rabbinic enactment. It's like a fix. There's some problems, so let's institute this new thing to fix it, as opposed to a gzera, which is don't do this, lest you do that. Clear?
Got it. So enactments is in 2 categories then.
Enactment and decree, takana and gzera. Yeah?
Is this your term, like 2,5, or is this coined by...
No, I just made this up.
Okay.
Yeah, you can argue with me, you can come up with your own classification. This is how I see it. Could be there's more that I'm missing, and could be some of these you can mush together. Takana and gzera, maybe it could be one thing. That's fine. Okay, so this is all kind of the background to the sources that we're going to see. Now, just so we have the right frame of mind, I just want to remind everybody that there's I think a very well-known concept called Yeridas Adoros. So to speak, the decline of the generations, that we believe that with every generation, further from Sinai is going to have some level of a lower understanding, a lack of clarity of the Torah as compared to those from earlier generations. The closer we are to the Torah, the more clarity that you could have to understanding what was Hashem's intent. And as we move further away, that clarity gets lost. So inherently in that, there would be this relationship with earlier generations, so to speak, I don't know, being smarter in terms of intellectual prowess, but being smarter in terms of their understanding of the Torah. We generally assume that they had a much greater clarity in the Torah that they're transmitting, in contrast to later generations, which will have less information, despite having more information in a general sense, but less Torah information or lack of less clarity. The Torah, let's say, of Rashi was so clear that he had a very limited number of svarim that he had to access in order to understand the entirety of Torah. Whereas today, if you look in this room, look at all these svarim, they're all trying to understand the Torah, and in a sense, some of these svarim are creating, new ways to examine and interpret the Torah, but there's also, it's a sign of like a certain lack of clarity, that we don't want to have it crystal clear. We need to see all kinds of different ways of analyzing things, and that's a product of what's called Yeridus Hadoros. Question?
Yeah, if that's the case, how do we relate then to like 20th century poskim and Torah scholars?
Right, good. Yeah, it's very good. We're going to get there. Don't worry. If later on you still have that problem, please remind me. Great. So, just like I think it was mentioned last week in one of the shmuzin, that there's this story of Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, that he was on a plane and all his kids were, and grandkids, they were taking care of him, giving him, pillows and drinks and everything. And then there was this secular person next to him, and he said, well, I wish my grandkids would treat me like that. What's the difference between my grandkids and your grandkids? So he was saying how, in the secular world, the further you are away from, the earlier man, the more developed you are, the more evolved you are. If you believe we came from apes, so the further I am from monkeys, the better I am, as opposed to the way, in Judaism we look at it, the further I am away from Sinai, the less clarity I have, so automatically the earlier generations have so much more to learn from, so much more to give over, so much more wisdom, so therefore that creates that respect. So if you look at source number 1 on your sheet, this is a Gemara in Shabbos that I think is the best, expression of the concept of Yeridus Hadoros. It seems to just be this given fact of the reality of the world that we live in. Why it is that way? Why did Hashem make that way? It's an interesting question, but just the phrase Yeridus Hadoros I haven't seen in so many early Sfarim, like that phrase, but the concept is very clear over here. Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rava bar Zimuna. Im Rishonim b'nei Malachim. Let's take for granted, and this is just to remind ourselves, these are the Amoraim speaking, about earlier generations, let's say the Tanaim. So, Im Rishonim b'nei Malachim. Let's assume for a second that the Tanaim are like angels. Anu b'nei Anashim. So then, in contrast to the Tanaim, who are like angels, we are like humans. We are humans. Im Rishonim b'nei Anashim. Now, let's shift it a little bit. Let's say the Tanaim are like, the earlier generations are like humans. Anu kachamorim. Then that would automatically make us like donkeys. The contrast between us in this generation, says the Amoraim, and the earlier generation is so vast that it's like an angel and a human, or a human and a donkey. And the Gemara just says an interesting line, Rabbi Chanina ben Dosa v'shal Pinchas ben Yair. These were two very special donkeys that, happened to be very smart, and one of these donkeys didn't do Averos, which is interesting. So don't think that we're like donkeys like of that sort. Elo kashar v'chamorim. We're like regular donkeys. So the Gemara is just expressing this idea that we're supposed to have a certain attitude towards earlier generations, Amoraim to Tanaim, so I would say all the more so our generation to Chazal. Question?
I see this in regards to the Tanaim versus the Amoraim. The Tanaim were very, very close to the temple service, etc. But I find that idea difficult in relating to like me versus Rashi, for example. I mean not me, but like the greatest of our generation compared to Rashi.
You would put them on equal footing, you're saying?
Well, I just...
or not make that vast a difference?
I just, like, in just a logical sense, I just don't see why it's necessarily true.
Okay, I see what you're saying. You're basically saying it's not like a straight line, it's more like a curve in terms of the decline of... it was a very, very sharp contrast from Tanaim to Amoraim, but then it kind of petered off a little bit, and now the contrast isn't as vast.
Well, just given that, like, what we're talking about ultimately is proximity to, what it was to live under. Maybe it was from Sinai, maybe it was from...
Right, so I think where I'm coming from in terms of my understanding of this Gemara is that it doesn't specify who it's referring to, it just says Rishonim and Anu. So I said Rishonim means Tanaim, and just to remind everybody, the Tanaim were even after the temple was destroyed. It was a very large period from Second Temple until 200 something CE. So even from like one generation, from Rabbi Yehuda Nasi to his Talmud Rav, could also perhaps fit into this Gemara. So, but yeah, I could hear that. You want to say something? No? Okay, I'll note that. But I'm just trying to create a certain, attitude or perspective towards Chazal, that if this is what they're saying about themselves, so perhaps, at the very least us, the posting of our generation, they have these lines, I wasn't going to talk about this, but like that the Chazon Ish was like a Rishon, or the Vilna Gaon was like a Tana. Like we have certain exceptional cases where we have these modern day, so to speak, poskim and Talmidei Chachamim that we kind of look at as like on that high level pillar, but that's usually the exception than the rule. Like people don't necessarily assume that the poskim of today are on the same level as Rashi, or at the very least they don't see themselves that way. But okay, fine. So I'm just going to bring a few Gemaras that basically explicitly or implicitly show that there is this concept that we're supposed to listen and believe in the Chachamim. And we're going to analyze exactly where is that coming from. Where's that obligation come from? So in source number 2, it's Gemara Nivamos, that there's a Mishnah that mentions something called an Isser Mitzvah. There's something that's Usser that you're not allowed to do, it's prohibited, that's called an Isser Mitzvah. And the Gemara asks, what's that referring to? It says referring to Shnios. Now Shnios are a rabbinically mandated secondary prohibited relationship. The Torah says you're not allowed to have incest, you're not allowed to marry your sister, you're not allowed to marry your mother, you're not allowed to marry your daughter. So those are Torah incestual relationships. And the Chachamim added on from the primary ones the term shnios, the secondary ones. So there's not that anyone hopefully would ever think to do this, but let's say their grandmother or their grandfather's sister. Those are not technically biblically prohibited, but Chazal came along and created secondary prohibitions called shnios. And the Gemara asks, Amai Kari Le Mitzvah? So, okay, fine, there's an Isser that the Gemara over there is talking about, called Shnios. Why is it called Isser Mitzvah? It says, Amar Rabbi Mitzvah L'Shmo Divrei Chamim. It's an Isser Mitzvah because there's a mitzvah to listen to the Chamim who engineered and created this rabbinic concept. So you see already apparently there's a mitzvah to listen to the Chamim, which we'll analyze where that mitzvah come from. That's source number 2. Source number 3, another Gemara Nivamos, in the continuation of that Gemara, it says, Amarava, remez the shnios min Torah minayim. Sometimes, even though it's a rabbinic law, the Gemara will sometimes try to find a hint to this idea somewhere in the Torah. Rabbi Yehuda Amar, I skipped some of the earlier sources, it says, Rabbi Yehuda Amar mehacha, there's a pasuk in Koheles, which is interesting, we're calling that Minatorah, that's its own topic, why Koheles usually is part of Nach, not from the Torah, but okay, fine. Sometimes the body of Tanakh is referred to as the Torah. V'izen mechiker tikin mishalim harbe. So this is a kind of a vague pasuk in Koheles or Ecclesiastes, if you prefer. I don't know what that means, but what does that pasuk mean? V'amar ula amar Rabbi Elazar. Kodem Sheba Shlomo. So Koheles was written by Shlomo Melech, the son of David, the second king of the Davidic line. So what did Shlomo say? Well, he said this pasuk. He said this verse in Koheles, and before Shlomo came along the scenes. Haisa Torah domin kafifa she'ein la oznaim. The Torah was like a basket without any handles. So it's not so easy to pick up the basket, especially it's a very big basket. Ad sheba Shlomo v'asad oznaim. So Shlomo came along, the Gemara says Shlomo instituted certain rabbinic ideas even all the way back then. So you see, again, what we mentioned earlier, that I mentioned Chazal are the ones who make tikanos. Really, you see Nevi'im made tikanos. So that kind of fits that idea. We said they are kind of technically Chazal. Shlomo came along and made some tikanos. So he made oznaim, literally ears, but it means handles to the basket. This pasuk is a reference that there's this concept of adding handles to the basket. The Torah is a basket. It's very hard to pick up, which I guess is a metaphor for it's hard to keep the Torah in a proper way. So once you make handles, now it's so much easier to keep the Torah because we added fences around the Torah. So you see this pasuk in Koheles, this verse in Koheles is kind of, it's a hint to the concept that the Chamim should make handles for the basket. Rav Kana Amar Mehacha, another source. Ushmarti Mishmarti, this is probably a more famous source of the rabbinic concept that the concept that Rabbanan are meant to create a fence around the Torah. The Torah says in Vayikra, make a watch for my watch, safeguard my watch. Asu mishmeres mishmarti. That's how we understand the pasuk. It says, Ushmartim es mishmarti, asu mishmeres mishmarti. Make a watch for my watch, or make a guard for my guard, however you want to translate that. But what that basically means is that, we're supposed to be shamor the Torah. Shomer the Torah is supposed to be shomer Torah mitzvos. Make a shmirah for the Torah, make a fence around the Torah. So this is a Torah source telling the rabbis that they should make a fence around the Torah, which implies to us that we're supposed to go along with that. That's not something that they do and we're supposed to rebel against. The Torah is actually mandating this fence around the Torah. Amalei Abai Rav Yosef, Hadraisehi. This is actually not a rabbinic concept, this is a Torah concept. There's a Torah obligation for the Chachamim to make tekanos around the Torah. That basically implies that there's an obligation from the Torah that the rabbis have some sort of authority. So Gemara says, Deraisa upirshu rabbanan. So you're right, it's a Torah level, but it's something that the rabbis came along and explained, which is an interesting line, because the Gemara says, Kol Torah nami pirshu rabbanan. The whole Torah is explained by the rabbanan. So really this is not the source for shnios, because again, shnios is a drabanan concept. There's a Torah obligation on Chazal to make fences around the Torah, but that doesn't make shnios necessarily a Torah obligation. Now, I was going to ask this later, but I'll ask this now. Has anyone heard of the concept that a drabanan is really a deraisa? A rabbinic law is really a Torah law? Raise your hand if you've heard this before. It's an idea that gets thrown around. Every Durban is really deraisa, which is an interesting line, and we'll point out there's problems with it. But we'll see that it has some basis in the upcoming sources. Now, maybe a more famous Gemara, the one I'm quoting, that there's a Torah obligation to listen to the Chamim. It's a Gemara in Shabbos. It's talking about Hanukkah, everybody's favorite holiday in wintertime. So, the only holiday. Amarav Chia Ashi Amarav Hamadik Ner Shal Chanukah Tzarech Levarach. When you light your Chanukah candles, you're supposed to give bracha. Now, brachas are a durabanan, right? It's a rabbinic concept to make a blessing before you do a mitzvah. Before I put on my tefillin, before I eat a meal and wash my hands, before I take my lulav, you're supposed to make a blessing before you do the mitzvah. And that's a rabbinic concept. But those are all Torah, not all the examples I just gave, but whatever. So, usually we associate birkas and mitzvahs are called with a Torah mitzvah, tefillin, lulav. So we're saying you also have to make a bracha for Hanukkah. Gemara asks, what's the bracha? My mavarach. I'm in source number 4, I forgot to mention that. Mavarach asher kishan b'mitzvosav v'tivanu hahadlik ner shel Hanukkah. Which, if you're not a native Hebrew speaker, you don't realize the subtlety that just went on over here. What does that exactly say? We make a bracha. Blessed are you, God, who commanded us, who sanctified us with his mitzvos, and he commanded us to light Hanukkah candles. Now, is that a true statement? Did Hashem command us to light Hanukkah candles? So Gemara immediately asks, Ve'echan tzivanu, where did God command us to light Hanukkah candles? Ravivi amar milo sasur. From a pasuk, do not sway from the words of the rabbis, which we're immediately about to analyze. So the Gemara is saying, kind of an astonishment, that I was commanded by God to do a rabbinic mitzvah. And the Gemara says, yes, you were commanded by God to do a rabbinic mitzvah. This pasuk, which we're now going to see in source number 5. Question, yeah?
I just wanted to clarify, is what came out from the Shnius Gemara that Chazal has a deraisa obligation to add to the Torah, but its additions are considered derabanan? I just want to make sure I got that clear.
That's seemingly what the Gemara is saying, yeah. And as I mentioned, that implies somewhat that we have to listen to those decrees. If the Torah is mandating Chazal to make decrees around the Torah, seemingly, what's the point if no one's going to listen? You're right, yeah. Well, what you're saying is something to think about, for sure. Source number 5. So, there's a parsha in the Torah, in Parshat Shoftim, there's a whole section discussing what's called a Zaken Mamre, a rebellious sage, a rebellious elder, where basically, in a nutshell, I don't think I'm going to read the whole thing right now, you can look yourself in source 5, it's 5 psukim, basically discussing that there's an idea that if there's ever a doubt in halacha, we don't know what to do, so you should go to the sages and they'll tell you what to do. So if the sages rule on a certain matter, and another sage says, you know what, I disagree, you're wrong, and he argues on them. So we have that. We have machlokas, right? We have machlokas. But if when there's a Sanhedrin, there's a mitzvah, you're supposed to go with the majority. The majority say a certain thing is mutter, and there's one sage who says, I'm not listening, I'm saying it's asur, I'm going to argue with you, and there's a whole detailed explanation of what exactly has to happen. He goes back to his hometown, he tells everybody, don't listen to those rabbis, listen to me, I'm the one who's right. So he's called a rebellious sage, and he gets the death penalty. So in that discussion of it's called Zakin Mamre. If you look, I bolded verse 11, Yud Aleph. It says, Al Pia Torah Asher Yerucha, according to the Torah that he, i.e. the sage, will rule for you. Val Mishpa Asher Yomru Lecha, and the rulings that they will tell you. Ta'aseh, do what the sages tell you to do. Lo tasur, that's the verse we quoted earlier. Lo tasur min hadavar asher yigidu lecha, do not sway from the matter that they tell you, the sages tell you. Yamin usmol, left or right, which we'll analyze later what that means. But seemingly there's a positive injunction, I must listen to what the rabbis tell me, and I cannot sway from what they tell me. There's a mitzvah saseh and mitzvah lo saseh, which we'll immediately analyze. So, on a very basic level, this is to go back to the previous notes, so the Gemara asks, where am I commanded by God to light Hanukkah candles? It's from this verse of don't sway from what the rabbis tell you to do. It's interesting, it's quoting the negative and not the positive. The positive is do what they said. We're saying we're commanded and not swaying from what they said, but okay, fine. But the point is that it's referring to these verses. So what exactly is the intent of these verses? There's two questions that we have to think about, and we're going to see differences of opinion. First of all, who are these two verses, this one verse, who is this talking about? Which rabbinic body is it referring to? And in the simple context, it's referring to the Sanhedrin, and it mentions, there's an allusion to going to Yerushalayim, to the great Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, but is that referring to Chazal, the Gemara from, the rabbis from the Gemara? Is it referring to rabbis from today? So that's something that we have to keep in mind. Who is this referring to? And second, what is it referring to in terms of what do they tell me? Because I mentioned before, there's 5 things that Chazal do. Is this verse talking about, their biblical interpretations? Or is it even referring to their rabbinic legislations? So these two questions are going to be a source of contention as we go further, but it's just something to keep in mind. Because it doesn't say, it just says, just seeing the second verse of source 5, Pasuk Tes. It says, Ubasel al-Kohanim ha-Levim vel-shofet asher yeh bayamim ahem. You shall go to the Kohen, the Levi, and the judge that will be in those days. So, historically, the Kohanim and the Levim were the greatest Torah sages of the generation, and they were the ones who usually would rule on matters of law because they didn't have jobs. They just learned Torah all day, and they worked in the Beis Mikdash, so they were considered the most learned ones. But there's also the Shofet, who's the judge. So I mentioned that this is referring to the Sanhedrin, which is how the Mefarshim, at the very least, explain it. But it's a little bit vague. And it says that Asher Bayamim Ahem, that will be in those days, which will be a source of contention. What does exactly that mean? Which days? Even today? If a Kohen in here says something and I argue on him, I'm going to get killed. So, thankfully not, but we'll see. Fine. Good. So, first we're going to analyze the opinion of the Rambam, who's probably the most famous opinion in this topic, and he's the source for what some of you have heard of. There's an idea that every D'Rabbanan is really a D'Oraisa. Because, we'll see, it's not so clear in the Rambam, but that's how at least some people interpret what he meant. So, there's 3 sources for the Rambam. First of all, the Rambam wrote a Sefer Mitzvos where he goes through the 613 commandments, and he lists them and gives a brief description of each one of them. So in source number 6, he's first discussing the assay, the mitzvahs, the positive mitzvah of do that which they command you. So he says, Atzivu shenitztavinu the Shama, the Beis Din HaGadol. There's a mitzvah that we were commanded to listen to the Beis Din HaGadol, the great court in Jerusalem. Naig kachol asher tzivanu. We should act according to everything they say. Whatever comes to something that's mutter, something that's asur, whatever they say, we have to follow everything they say. There's no difference in this, whether it's something that they received, i.e. in tradition, or something that they derived from the 13 principles. So this fits both of the 2 things I mentioned that Chazal do that are on a Torah level. Atoratios, that's an interesting phrase, try using that in a sentence. Or anything that they agreed to fence off a breach, which is at the very least referring to Gzeros, that if there's a breach, that the people are being lax in a certain mitzvah, and the rabbis come along and say, okay, we're now going to make a fence. It's a lot of allusions to fences over here, a lot of metaphors. So, but I believe he's also referring to tkanos. As much as I separate them, usually they go together. So, if they want to make a geder, a fence, or behetzen lamatzav misum, or they're trying to solve some sort of problem in their time. So the Rambam basically sounds like he didn't mention explicitly rabbinic mitzvos, but that could perhaps fit along with these also, because the rabbinic mitzvos were created for a certain reason. It's not so explicit, but seemingly he's kind of encompassed everything. I mentioned that there's 5 things Chazal do, and the Rambam kind of sounds like you have to listen to every one of them, at least what the Beis Hagadol determined. Anything that they decided is proper to do, that's going to give strength to the Torah, you have to do it. Hakol chayavim anu l'kaimo, every single one of them we are obligated to listen to, la'asoso, and do it, ulinhog alpi devreim, and follow their words, ubal navor aleim, and not to transgress them. Who amro yisrael, this is what's the source for this? It's the pasuk alpi Torah asher yerucha, according to the Torah that they rule for you, you have to do. And he quotes the Sifri, which I mentioned before. It's ironic. The Sifri is a midrash by Chazal. It's ironic, but what can you do? For the Chazal to tell you, you have to listen to Chazal. So it says in the Sifri, "Val mishpat asher yomru l'cha tased," according to the judgment which they tell you should do. Zu mitzvah saseh. It's a positive mitzvah. So it sounds like from this, there's a Torah obligation to listen to the Chachamim. Why do I have to listen to the rabbis? Because God said so. According to bar dinei mitzvah zuba sanadrin. Fine. So, as I said before, there's going to be some disagreements about this. So this is just the Rambam's opinion. And that's the Asay. And again, he only mentioned the Beis Hagadol. But then if you look at source number 7, where he's discussing the lo taseh, don't sway, lo tasur, from what the rabbi said. She's Yeranu mechaluk al balei hagabala. Now he doesn't mean Kabbalistic, Zohar, like Arizal stuff, because some say the Rambam didn't know about the Zohar, but even besides that, usually Balei Kabbalah is referring to the whole word lekabel is to receive. The masters of what they received. This is a reference to the Masorah, to the tradition, which I mentioned before. That's one of the jobs, it was mentioned over there, one of the jobs of Chazal is to transmit the Masorah. So who are the Balei HaMasorah? Seemingly not only the Beis Hagadol, but Chazal in general. They are the Balei HaMasorah. They're the ones who brought down from Sinai the oral Torah to us today in the 21st century. So he's saying we're not allowed to be cholak on them, we're not allowed to argue on them. Now, just background information, the Sefer Mitzvah, so the Rambam was written in Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic with Hebrew writing, because he was writing to an Arabic reading audience, and it was translated into Hebrew, so what we have is a Hebrew translation, and there's different translations. So I brought here the more standard translation, but in parentheses, I put another translation, Me'atike Hashmua, which is important, we'll see later, the copiers of the teachings. Meaning we're not allowed to argue on the copiers of the teachings, which is a funny expression, but we'll see who that's referring to soon. So, Aleim Shalom, peace be upon him. Mitzvahs, b'maaseh Torah, we're supposed to listen to their commands, and we're not allowed to sway from it. As it says in the Torah, V'hu amro, lo tasher min hadavar asher yigidu lecha. And then he brings another Sifri, which says that it's mitzvah lo saseh. Now, source 7, the second last line that's bold. Now, overall love zeh, hu zaken mamre. Now, this is interesting. Someone who argues on the rabbis, they're zaken mamre. Now, if you take that literally, that's pretty intense. He says v'chayv chenek, and they're liable to the death penalty. So I wouldn't stop there, because then that sounds like anyone who argues on Chazal is going to get killed. He says, so there's a whole list of, it has to be in this situation, he has to do that. I mentioned before, he has to go to his city and tell everybody I argue in the rabbis and follow me. There's a whole complicated thing. So it doesn't literally mean anyone who argues in the rabbis is getting the death penalty, and he's a Zaken Mamre, but it could lead, I believe he means, it could lead to Zaken Mamre, at least back in the day when there was a death penalty. And then the last source from the Rambam, source 8, in the beginning of the Mishnah Torah, he has a very concise listing of all the 613 mitzvahs again, instead of his more in-depth listing, and in there he writes it slightly differently. He says, Shalo lahamros al pi basin, not to rebel, not just to argue, not to rebel against the basin. And again, he didn't mention, this time, the Balei Kabbalah or the Matike Shmua. It sounds like he's focusing on the basin. So, as I mentioned before, there's 2 questions we have to keep in mind when we're discussing this topic, which is, who is these psukim referring to? Which body of rabbis? So the Rambam said a few times the Beis Din Gadol, which sounds like it's only talking about them, which seemingly would exclude Chazal, because the Beis Din Gadol kind of fell apart towards the end of the Second Temple period, and the Mishnah and Gemara is post that. So it sounds like perhaps the Rambam is not including them. Yeah?
Can you please explain the term Zach and Mamre?
It's like a whole topic into itself, but basically it's the rebellious sage who, that's what the Parsha in source number 5 is referring to, which is that if Chazal rule, the Sanhedrin rule on a certain matter one way, and one of the sages argues on them, and you're supposed to go with the rove, and basically the idea is that all the sages are meant to kind of let go of their own personal opinion and go with the majority opinion, and that's usually how it works. Let's say they put a vote, 12 say this, 9 say that, the Beis Din Gadol in Yerushalayim was 71 people, so let's say 50 say this and 21 say that. So the 21, who are the minority, are supposed to drop their personal opinion and go with the majority. If one of them maintains his opinion and argues on the Chachamim, and goes to his hometown and rules Lamaisa like them, and in other details which we won't get into now, then he would get the death penalty. So he's called a rebellious sage. But we're not talking about that so much. Yeah?
Are we saying that in source 6 that there's there's an assay to follow the low tasses of the rabbi? Like on the Kedei Ligdor principle?
Yeah, so that the Kedei Ligdor principle I understand to me is talking about the Gezeros of Chazal. So there's a low tasseh of there's an assay to listen to whatever they say. So if they say don't do this, so I'm supposed to listen to them. And by not listening to them, I have now transgressed apparently this assay. And the assay and lo tasseh seemingly would go together, so it would be kind of both. Is something confusing?
Yeah, I always was under the impression that an assay means you are commanded to do something.
You're supposed to listen to them. So if I don't listen to them,
right.
So I didn't do what I was supposed to do. At the same time, I also went against something I wasn't supposed to do. I'm not supposed to go against them, and I'm supposed to go with them. They're like mirrors of each other.
Right.
So by going against what they said don't do this, and don't eat don't move muksa, and I say I don't care, I'm going to move muksa. So I didn't listen to them, so I was mavatal the assay, even though they told me to not do something, right? Question?
So is it both an assay and a low assay?
Yeah, that's the point.
So you're over 2 doraisa.
Yeah, according to this, yeah, it's a double whammy.
Okay.
Yeah. Don't worry about it. Yeah, so I'm just pointing out that the Rambam stresses a bunch of times it's the Beis Din Gadol, although we did see in source number 7 that he mentioned the Balei Kabbalah and the Matikei Shmua, which sounds a little bit more broad, but we'll see. Yeah?
Does the Rambam include in his Taryag mitzvahs the mitzvah of listening to the Chachamim?
Yeah, so in source number 6 and 7, those are from his listing of the Taryag mitzvahs. So he's listing the positive mitzvah Kufayin Dalad, 174 out of 248, and Lo Saseh 312 out of 365. So, yeah, exactly. They're 2 of the 613 according to the Rambam. Fine. So there's actually a few opinions. What exactly did the Rambam mean? The Ramban, Nachmanides, as we'll see, argues very, very strongly against the Rambam. He thinks the Rambam went way too far, calling basically every Durabanan a Deraisa, which has a lot of implications. But he seemed to understand the Rambam meant very, very, very broadly. All of Chazal, anything Chazal said, that's all included in these mitzvahs, even though, as I mentioned, the Rambam's a little bit vague, or a little bit contradictory. So, source number 9 is a sefer called Kovetz Shiurim by Rav Elchanan Wasserman. He has a whole sefer on this topic. It's like a sub-sefer of Kovetz Shiurim called Kuntras Divrei Sofrim. It's like 80 pages long, not so long, but it's like a whole sefer on the topic of listening to the rabbis, and when yeah, when no, and why, and how. So he brings a few sources in here, so I'm just going to read it. As I said, it's a lot of information, but I'll try to pull out the main points. So, Kastav Sefer Marganisa Tava, which is a commentary on Sefer Mitzvos. V'zel Lashona. Di Shlomer, the Had Kasav Rambam is Sefer Gadol. The Rambam wrote a Mishnah Torah, his great book, Ubemini Mitzvos, Sheish Asay V'los Asay Deraisa, B'chol Asayagim, V'gzeros V'atikanos. There is a positive and negative commandment on the Torah level to listen to everything that Chazal said, whether it's their decrees, whether it's their enactments. So this sefer limits it. It's not including Chazal. It's not including the Gemara in the Mishnah. Only early, if you want to call it early Chazal, which is from the Beis Din Gadol in Yerushalayim, which only existed until a certain period of time. That's what the Ram is referring to, and which is why the Ram mentioned that a few times. I'm just going to skip a little bit. Okay, you can turn the page. Page 2. Now, it says in bold here, Aval Masha Gazru Beis Din Hagadol de Yavne de Usha. So the Beis Din of the great Sanhedrin got put into Gullus before they put themselves in Gullus, really, before the destruction of the Second Temple. And they moved around a few places. They went to Usha, and to Yavne and Usha, different places. So let's say they made a Gzera over there. They were in Yavne. Your yeshiva's Keren B'Yavne, so maybe that's near the city of Yavne, I don't know. But so the Beis Din over there, same Beis Din, they just moved and they made a decree. Upshita im gazru chachmei talmud, and all more so if even the Gemara, the rabbis of the Gemara, alchol shabatzal Beis Din Hagadol v'gamrei. Just give me to the bold part again. She'ena b'chol lav de lo tasur ela asmat ba'alma. There's no obligation to listen to them on a Torah level. It's only based in Hagadol Sheb Yerushalayim. When the Beis Din got put into exile, or in all more so post Churban, when it's just the Chachmei Talmud. So he says, according to the Rambam, there's no lo tasur, there's no asay and lo sasay if you don't listen to them. The Chen Kasav is Sefer Leif Sameach, which is another sefer on the Rambam. She'ein eslo la Rambam lava asay deraisa ela ba'over al pi Beis Din Hagadol. Fine. It says in the bold over here, says Rav Elchanan Wasserman, Av shehu davar chiddush, even though it is a bit of a novelty, l'chalik, to make a difference in the chachamim, l'lemor shelo kol divreihem shavin, but madrigasan, to say that the chachamim, there's certain chachamim that are more we listen to than others. So the Rav Elchanan Wasserman likes this approach, that it's only the Beis Din Hagadol Yerushalayim. I see we're running low on time, so I'm not going to read as much inside. So source number 10 is a sefer called Lechem Yehuda, which is a sefer, it's a commentary on the Mishnah Torah by someone named Rabbi Yehuda, I don't know how to pronounce that, Eias? I don't know. So he has a different approach. He wants to say the other extreme, which is everything's included. The Chachmei Gemara. And he also mentioned something that was skipped in the previous source, which is that the Rambam mentioned lahamros, to rebel. Now, there's a difference between transgressing and rebelling. If someone, really, really wants to play with their cell phone on Shabbos, assuming that's D'Rabbanan, and they're not trying to go against Chazal, they just, it's hard for them. They really need to play with their cell phone. So that would be called going... That wouldn't be called rebelling against Chazal. That just would not be listening to them. So some say, based off what the Rambam wrote, that it's only if someone rebels against Chazal, like the Zaken Mamre, like the elder, the sage, who's literally rebelling against the Chachamim. They all said to do this, and he's like, I'm not listening to you. I'm going and saying the opposite to my people. So it's only in some similar regard that someone would be rebelling against Chazal. That would be included in the mitzvah. But simply, so to speak, going against their words wouldn't be included. That's what someone wants to say. Question?
You're saying that a rebellion is more so like an active decision to disregard what Chazal said, or even like trying to convince other people to do so as well.
So the second one I think would be even a greater rebellion, but I think even minimally the first thing you said. What's actually interesting is what comes out from this approach, that's only rebellion, is that some say that there, maybe for this idea also, that someone breaks a D'Rabbanan b'shogeg. They didn't realize it was prohibited, they forgot it was prohibited, it was accidental. So someone who does an avera of a D'Rabbanan b'shogeg, they don't even have to do tshuva for that. Anyone heard that idea before? Yes, no, maybe so. So that fits a little bit better. That's not everyone agrees to that, but that is such an idea that's brought down, and that would fit a lot better with this approach. That it's only when someone is rebelling And if I break a Durban B'Shogeg, I forget it's muksa, I forget it's, I'm not allowed to eat chicken and milk together. I didn't know it was forbidden to have chicken and milk together, just in case you didn't realize you're not supposed to. So on a rabbinic level, so that's not a rebellion in any sense. That's just ignorance. Now, perhaps the person should learn the halachos and try to follow the rabbis, because that's, as we'll see, the right thing to do. But it wouldn't be a violation of these mitzvos, because that's only rebellion according to this. Yeah.
From my understanding, when the Torah gave both aseh and the los aseh, it doesn't prescribe any sort of like scenario modification or a kimton where that extends to.
Yeah.
So I'm struggling a little bit with Rabbi Hanan's shop that's limited to the basing of Yerushalayim, because it was the mitzvos were given so many generations before there was Jerusalem let alone a baking.
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's I didn't read all the psukim there, but there was allusions that Chazal picked up on in those psukim. It says, "Come to Valisa, you'll get up and go," and it says, "What does it mean? You'll get up and go?" So that's a reference to going up to Har Moriah, to the Temple Mount, which is where the Beis Hagadol in Yerushalayim sat, which Chazal say is the highest place in the world. Was in Yerushalayim, whether that's metaphorical or literal. But the idea is that when you're going up, you go up to Eretz Yisrael, and when you're in Eretz Yisrael, you go up to the Har Bais. And that's, so what significance is there to sages being in a high place? So at the very least, you would see that this is a reference to the Beis Hagadol in Yerushalayim, even though it didn't exist yet, but it's kind of like preempting that.
Could you argue it just begins there?
Yeah, for sure. There's no reason to say it only is referring to that, but the fact that the Rambam stressed it a few times leads him to believe that this is a specific mitzvah, and the hope is that, there will be a Beis Mikdash once again, and there will be a Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim once again, so this mitzvah is not that totally irrelevant. It might come back again, although the assumption is when Mashiach's here there won't be rebellions anymore, but hypothetically the mitzvah could still apply, right? Yep.
We're saying for source 10, are we saying that...
I didn't really read source 10 yet, but yeah.
Sorry, I thought we were...
I was explaining more source 9, but yeah, sorry. Whatever, it doesn't matter. Yeah, what were you saying?
But regarding the some say that it's only the...
Yeah, okay, fine, yeah.
That's only for the low asa, right? It would still be bustling an asa.
That's a good question, because the Rambam who mentioned Shalom Hamros was by the Lotus, right? That's where you're coming from. Yeah. So I think they mean it to be both, because they're kind of looked at as mirror images of each other. If the Lotus is only when it comes to, well, it's an interesting point. I don't know what it would mean to listen to them. That's inherently not rebelling against them, right? Okay, I see what you're saying. I'm not sure I have to think about that. Yeah.
There seems to be a few points in Jewish history. I was just learning Sefer Malachim, Perek, Gimel, where it seems to be that where it seems to be that Torah is largely forgotten among the Jewish people. And
Sure.
there's a few other times in which that happens, as brought down either in Sukkim or in Chazal themselves. So how do I square that with this idea that we have perfect transmission?
That's an amazing question, but not this specific topic. No, absolutely. That's something to investigate further. That we believe that there was an unbroken chain, and yet there are psukim that seem to imply that the Jews basically, forgot everything. You even have an example of this in the Gemara, where Rabbi Kiva famously had 24,000 students, and he was like the main pillar of the tradition. And then all his students died, and so there's just Rabbi Kiva left. So there were other stages, but they weren't as monumental and the prime focus of our tradition. And then he ended up having 5 new students, so everything kind of comes from Rabbi Kiva. But so you see at the very least you have one person left in the chain. But that's definitely a great point. But for another time. No problem. Yeah, so the Lechem Yehuda in source 10, he's coming to argue on what I just said, that it's only talking about Beis Yerushalayim and it's only talking about rebellion. He says the opposite, that it's talking about even the Chachmei HaTalmud, even the Gemara, and it's not just rebelling, but even just transgressing, just not doing what they said, that would be going against this mitzvah. Fine. Source number 11 is Minchas Asher by Rav Asher Weiss Shlita, who's a very big posik today. And he writes something very interesting. Source 11. Amnam Rambam Sefer Mitzvos Kasav. She's Yiranod Melachlok Al Balia Kabbalah. That's the version we had. And other versions have that's a typo, I should say, hashmua. Upashat dahainu hach. And in his mind, they're referring to the same people. So the Mishnah Torah custom the Ravina of Rav Ashi Hagusof Gedolei Chachmei Yisrael Matikei Shmua. So I mentioned before that phrase is very important. Matikei Shmua is the Rambam's catchphrase to referring to the Chachmei Gemara. So Ravina Rav Ashi, they're the end of the Gemara period. So when he says you're not supposed to go against the Matikei Shmua, that's referring to even the Chachmei Yisrael. So Rav Ashi believes that there's a very strong proof that the Rambam wasn't referring to only the Beis Din Gadol. He was referring even to the Chachmei Talmud, which is how most people seem to understand them. He says, "Move on the fizeh, machiyesh bezeh. Od b'chol tekanos Chazal ad chatimas Talmud yesh gam ken mitzvos lo sasur kevan shechazal niskenu al yedei kol Chachmei Yisrael o ruban." Since it was determined by the majority, or even all of the Chachmei Yisrael, to enact certain things, so it makes sense that we should listen to them. Okay, so that was all the Rambam. Took longer than I thought. That's the more famous, I think, understanding of things. Let's go with Rav Ashwai's approach and the Lechem Yehuda's approach, that the Rambam is very, very expansive, that, anything Chazal said, it falls under these two mitzvahs of listening to them and not swaying from them. So the Ramban, Nachmanides, he has a commentary on Sefer Mitzvos, and he has pages and pages and pages of questions on this Rambam. He brings like 15 different Gemaras, and he has tons of questions. Basically, you can summarize his questions in a few things. First of all, how could you say every Durabanan is Deraisa? That's basically what the Rambam is saying. Every Durabanan is really a Deraisa. Every rabbinic law is really a Torah law, because the Torah is telling me to listen to the rabbinic law. So he says in that case, that's source 12, yeah. Thank you. So the Ramban is saying that would mean that if someone moves muksa, he should technically get lashes, because if someone eats pig, they just did biblical prohibition and should technically get lashes. So if someone moves muksa, if someone sits on a tree, which Chazal said you're not allowed to do, he says, Chazal even said you're not supposed to take big steps on Shabbos. You're supposed to take regular steps. If you take a big step, you just went against Chazal, so you're saying someone takes a big step on Shabbos, you're going to give him 39 lashes? How could it be? And it happens to be, the Rambam explains that there's no lashes for breaking a Durabanan, at least on a Torah level, but that's due to technicality. So the Ramban is saying, but that just doesn't make any sense to say that a person really should be getting lashes for breaking Durabanans when, he just sees that as going too far. And then the bigger question he has is we have a famous rule, Savik Deraisa L'chumra. If you have a doubt in a matter of a Torah law, you're stringent. And Savik Durabanan L'kula. If you have a doubt in the rabbinic legislation, you can be mekel, you can be lenient. So the Ramban says this distinction makes no sense. If every Durabanan is really Deraisa, if every rabbinic law is really on a Torah level, we should be just as strict when a doubtful case of a Durabanan as a Deraisa. Okay, question? Come on. Yeah, you're thinking. Okay, good. This requires a lot of thinking. So, he brings a bunch of sources that you see that this just can't be. And in source number 13, he says, and don't tell me, he rejects this approach. He says, and don't tell me that Chazal, the rabbis, when they came up with the rabbinic legislation, they kind of put a built-in condition that if you have a case of a doubt, we'll let you be lenient. Meaning, they can make up whatever they want. They're Chazal, they're the rabbis, they're making this up for the first time. Anytime they make a rabbinic legislation, they could build into it an escape clause that if there's a case of doubt, you can be lenient. He says that can't be. He doesn't explain why.
Why can it not be?
He doesn't say why. And if you look at the end of source 13, the last bold sentence, these matters are not proper and they're not the truth of the matter, basically. He doesn't really explain why. There's different explanations we can discuss later that are suggested, but he just leaves you scratching your head that sounds pretty good. No, that's a pretty reasonable explanation. In fact, source number 14 and many other sources say this is what the Rambam believes. The Rambam believes every Durabanan is a Deraisa, but they said at the get-go that you can be lenient in a case of doubt. The source 14 is a sefer called Zohar Rakia, nothing to do with the Zohar. It's a sefer on the 613 commandments by the Rashbats, one of the Rishonim, and he tries to defend the Rambam from the Ramban. And he says, Yachol Rambam Latarzo, Volomar, Shekach Hayaseh Satakana. When they made their enactment, they built into it, Shachachamim Asu Davar Zebet Tnai. This matter is prohibited only on condition that it's a definite case. If it's definitely milk and meat, that's chicken and milk, then you can't eat it. But if I'm not sure, did milk fall in this or not, then you can eat it. Like, they built that into the Takana at the get-go. That's exactly what the Rambam would say. Okay. So what is the Ramban's approach? At the end of the day, you have these psukim. No, you have these verses. So how does the Ramban learn? Which is really source number 15, which I'll just say outside, that, as I said before, there's two questions. We have to ask, when it says lo tasur and everything they say tasa, who is this referring to, and what is it referring to? So the Ramban understands it is referring to the Chachmei HaTalmud. It is talking about all the Chachamim, but in something very specific. It's referring to their interpretation of the psukim and their usage of the drashos of the Yigul Midos and their transmission of the Masorah of Halach Moshe Sinai. That's why I split things up into these two categories of Torah things that Chazal contributed and the rabbinic things that Chazal contributed. It's only the Torah things that they contributed. If Chazal tell you this is how you interpret the psukim, so we're not allowed to come along and say they're wrong, I have my interpretation. Now, you have on this shelf here dozens and dozens and dozens of mafarshim on the Chumash, and they're each giving different explanations, but they're not coming along and saying the Chazal are wrong. If the Chazal say that this is the explanation, they're usually referring to it in a halachic sense. But there's so many lessons, there's so many layers, there's 70 faces of the Torah, that you can have multiple parallel explanations for the same psukim. Giving my own explanation of the Torah is not necessarily arguing on Chazal. It's just saying that, yes, Chazal have their way of looking at it. There's the four levels of interpretation. There's Pshat, Drash, Sod, Remez. So usually Chazal are saying what's called Drash. They're expounding laws from the psukim, and in those drashos, the Ramban says we're not allowed to argue. But when it comes to Pshat, when it comes to, Remez, Sod, maybe making my own drash in addition to what Chazal said, that could be permissible as long as I'm not arguing on them. Yeah?
So, in the opinion that we kind of lump Chazal together all the way to the end of the Gemara, given how much the Gemara recorded, based on that opinion, why wouldn't they have recorded the mitzvah such that we had to wait for Rishonim to actually?
That's a great question. I don't know. Yeah, he's just, for those who don't know, he's referring to, I spoke about this a little bit Friday night at the Super-esque Shabbos, that the Gemara in a bunch of places in Midrashim say that there's 613 commandments, but they don't tell you what they are. Here and there they'll say this is mitzvah, but they don't actually give you a listing. It wasn't until 600 years later that the Rishonim came along and gave you their lists, but I don't know. They're trying to tell you what they think Chazal meant. They're not arguing the Gemara, they're trying to explain the Gemara. Okay, so that's the Ramban. So at the end of the day, the Ramban says, let's go with Rav Shweiss, that everything Chazal said, all of Chazal, all the way to the end of the Gemara, we're not allowed to argue on them, we're not allowed to argue on Hanukkah, we're not allowed to argue on, or go against or transgress Muksa. And the Ramban says, no, rabbinic laws are not included in this, it's only their interpretation of the psukim. And he says that he proves this from Zaken Mamre that you see that we only kill a guy. The Gemara gives examples and details of when the rebellious sage is killed. It's only when he's arguing on them in an interpretation of the Torah. So the Ramban sees that as proof that this whole parsha is only talking about interpretations of the Torah. Now, a question that's asked is according to the Ramban. Yeah, question?
Would the Ramban then just say, while it's not a deraisa violation to go against the Talmud Rabbanan, it's still something you should be doing because it's
amazing. That's exactly what I'm about to talk about. You're right on target. According to the Ramban, why do I have to listen to their gezeras? Why do I have to listen to their takanas? Why do I have to listen to their mitzvos? If it's not the mitzvah, that's what we started off. Why do I have to listen to the rabbis? Well, we have an answer for the Ramban, but according to the Ramban, why do I have to listen to the rabbis? You're right. It's a nice thing to do. What is it? So this is asked by Rav Elchanan Wasserman in source 18. But before we see that, I want to look at source. Source 16. I have here in bold about Sarach Iyun Ladasa Ramban Me'ezet Tamanu Mitzuvin Lishmoa Divrei Chazal. Why do we have to listen to them? So before we see his answer in source 18, let's look at the Gemara in source 17. There's a Gemara in Bava Kama, which maybe you've heard of before. Amar of Shmuel Bar Nachmani Menayin LaMotzi Mechavero Lavaraya. If I go up to you and I say, "Hey, your cell phone, that's mine," and then you'll say, "Prove it," and I'll say, "You prove it's not mine." Who's in the right? Me or him? The guy with the phone. So that's called a motzi mechaver alavaraya. That's a halachic principle. A motzi, one is trying to extract from his friend. Alavaraya, he has to bring the proof. If I go up to you and say, that phone is mine, Well, who's holding it? You. So I have to prove it. You don't have to prove anything. Why do you have to prove it? You're holding the phone. The one who's holding it, possession is 9/10 of the law, basically. So, Gemara asks, what's the source for this halachic concept? Shneimar, Gemara brings the pasuk, Mi bal dvarim yigash aleihem. Whoever has a dispute in law, they will approach you and they will judge it. Yagish raya aleihem. They will present the proof. The one who wants to extract something from his friend, he will present the proof. Maskil Ravashi has a question on this. Halam alikra. Why do I need a pasuk? Svarahu. It's a logical. It makes sense. It's logical to say that the one who doesn't have the thing and is trying to take it away from someone, he's the one who has to prove it. Why would I need a Torah verse to tell me that the guy holding his phone has to prove it's his phone? So this is a concept that gets quoted a lot. Lam alikra svarahu. And what you see from this Gemara is that something that's logical. That's logically sound, and it's a question: how do you define what's logically sound? Because today, logic, whatever anyone says, they claim is logical, but something that's actually logically sound is even better than a verse, because I don't need a verse. I can figure it out myself. If I can figure it out myself, I don't need a Torah verse to tell me. So this is part of the reason why a Kal V'chomer has weight on a Torah level, because a Kal V'chomer is a logical construct, a logical argument. It's a Torah valid source for something. Is just a Kal V'chomer because it's all logical. So we see logic can be equal, if not better, than a Torah verse. So based off that, source 18, Rav Chana Wasserman quotes his Rebbe, Rav Shimon Shkop. He answered me the following. Again, where does the Ramban know that we're supposed to listen to the Tkanos and Gzeros of Chazal? Because whatever they say, they're assuming, as I mentioned before, Rishonim Kamalachim Anu Kamayadam. The assumption is that everything Chazal said is with pure, unadulterated, unbiased Torah logic, trying to find the root of the matter of what does God want from us. So it's logical. Chazal aren't just there to get you. They're not just to make your life more miserable, more difficult. When they came up with their Gzeros, they had a logical reason for it. It made sense to them. And so since the whole thing is logical, and that's just as good as a Torah verse, the Ramban would agree, according to this, that there is a biblical obligation to listen to the Chamim, but it's not from a verse of Lo Tasur. It's a logical construct. Since I have to listen to logic, I have to listen to the Chamim because they're the best logic we can think of in terms of what I should and shouldn't do. Yeah?
Where is this based in that that logic is better than Sukkim?
Just from how's the Gemara and Baba Kama know it? Or they're coming from the Gemara and Baba Kama?
Yes. How's
the Gemara know?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a good question. I mentioned Kal V'chomer, which is one of the Yugel Midos, Shator Nedreshes Behem, is purely logical. So you see that logic has Torah validity. That's my best guess where they know that from. Or it was just self-evident that the Torah doesn't need to tell me something I can figure out myself, basically. Something like that. Okay, we're running out of time, basically, and we'll have to wind down and summarize. Yeah, question?
Yeah, how does that, if you say that because you have the logic, it's equal to or better than a pasuk, how does that get around the questions that the Ramban posed regarding the Safek Deraisa, the Kula, and the lashes? Could you still run into the same?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question. Because I'm low on time, I'm skipping some things. But in source 18, you'll see he addresses that. He basically says that the logic is only if it's a definite rabbinic legislation. But if it's a case of doubt, the logic doesn't follow somehow. The svara isn't there. The svara is only in a vadai and not a safek. I don't fully understand that, to be honest, but he tries to address it at least. Yeah.
How does this position of the logic of Chazal being the basis for the Ramban's view about our the chiyuv to follow what Chazal does? How does that apply to gezeros that don't apply today, for instance?
That's a great question. I have to think about that. That's a very good question. That's a whole topic in itself. We could spend a whole hour talking about that. How certain things that Chazal instituted for specific reasons, when those reasons don't apply anymore, oftentimes the legislation still is binding. The question would be why, especially in light of this. That's not always the case. There's exceptions. I have to think about that. Thank you. That's a good question. Okay. Another very, very important source in this whole topic is the Sefer Chinuch, written anonymously by one of the Rishonim. If you look at source number 20, he says, "V'noges mitzvah zu bizman shebesed hagadol b'Yerushalayim." This mitzvah of listening to the rabbis applies when there's Beis Din Hagadol in Yerushalayim. V'zacharim and kevos, men and women have to listen to this. Shal kol mitzvah lasos kol asher yoru, everything they say. U'bechlal mitzvah gam kain, including this mitzvah is what? L'shmoa v'lasos b'chol zman izman. He takes this to the most extreme. You have to listen in every single time, every single generation, kamitzvah sashofet, like the command of the judge. Kolmar hachacham hagadol asher yeh beinenu bizmanenu. In every generation, he says this applies. Not just Chazal. He goes even further and says, in every generation, you have to listen to the rabbi of those generations. And he brings the pasuk I mentioned before. It says, "Bayamim asher yu bayamim ahem." The verse itself says, "Go to the judge that will be in those days." And he quotes the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah that says, even if he's a judge like Yiftach. Yiftach was one of the Shoftim, and he wasn't considered such a big Talmid Chacham. So whether your judge is like Shmuel, who was the biggest Talmid Chacham of the generation, or he's like Yiftach, which wasn't such a big Talmid Chacham, you got what you got. You read Sidoros, you don't have the best Talmid Chacham, but he's what you got. He says you have to listen to him. And I'll explain why. In source number 21, I'll just read it outside. He explains, what's the point of all this? Why do we have to listen to the Chamim? Not what's the source. Why do I have to do this? And he says that basically, this goes without saying, everybody thinks differently. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. Well, imagine if that were true for every single mitzvah and every single halacha. Every single person in this room will tell me what they think the Torah means when it says to put on tefillin, when it says to put a mezuzah up, Kriya Shema, every mitzvah. If I would just ask every Jew, they would have their own opinions. And he says that it would just never end. You would have millions and millions and millions of Torahs. You wouldn't have one united Torah. So the intent of Hashem was, first of all, with the mitzvah to follow the rove, follow the majority, that when you have a group of sages and they rule on something, you follow the majority, even if the minority might be right, hypothetically, but we need to have some sort of standards. We go with the majority, and therefore everyone's going to follow what the majority says. And he says in a more general sense that the people are supposed to listen to the Chamim. Because why the Chamim? He mentions that they're the ones who sat and sweated and worked hard to figure out what is the intent of the Torah, what does Hashem want from me? And they're doing it l'shem Shemayim. And in every generation we have people like that, and we know who those people are. We don't have to guess. We don't have to. It's going to be a little bit discussed tomorrow, I think, the role of Gedolim. But in every generation, there are people who worked tirelessly and with a lot of effort, not effortlessly, with a lot of effort, to figure out what does the Torah want. And in every generation, the Sefer Chanukh says, Hashem wants us to follow what they say. And he mentions, even if they might be mistaken. Let's say Hashem really wants the halacha to be like this, but the Chamim of your generation ended up saying something else. Hashem says, that's okay, that's fine. Lo b'shamayim. I'm willing to go with the Chamim of that time, even if they made a mistake, because they tried their best, and the rest of the people are not going to be held accountable for that. They're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is listening to the Chamim, because we want one united Torah. We don't want so many disparate things, and this is the only system. Hashem, is the best architect for how we're supposed to live our lives, and he felt in his infinite wisdom that this is the best method and solution to get a united Torah. So the Sefer Chanukh is telling us that it's not just, stam, as they say. It's not for fun that Hashem made it that you have to listen to the Chamim. There's a method to the madness. Now, the last source I just want to read is source number 23 on the last page from the Sefer Chanukh. From the Minchas Asher, again from Rabbi Wolfe. What does he say? So the Sefer Chanukh actually contradicts himself a little bit. First he says you have to listen to the Beis Din Hagadol. That sounds like only the high court in Yerushalayim. V'shuv kasav, and then he writes, v'chol mitzvah, including the mitzvah, l'shmoa es divrei chachama gadol shavador, to listen to the sages of every generation. So which is it? So he says, v'nira kamavur, da'av de'ikra mitzvah kaya Beis Din Hagadol bilvad, the main mitzvah, the ultimate intent of the pasuk is Beis Din Hagadol. Included in that mitzvah is also listening to every generation. He brings different sources for this, that you can have a mitzvah that there's what's called the ikr, and then there's what's included in the mitzvah. There's the main intent of the mitzvah, and then there's kind of a sub mitzvah that's within it. And he wants to say actually that he wants to make shalom. He's a Oav Yisrael, Rabbi Wolfe. He loves everybody. He wants everyone to like each other. So he wants to say this whole dispute about the Rambam and Ramban. Everybody agrees that really the intent of the Torah, he mentions, is Ratzon Hashem, is that as the Sefer Chanukh explained, Ratzon Hashem is that we listen to the Chamim. Hashem wants us to listen to the Chamim. what the argument is what is the main mitzvah referring to? And that has ramifications for perhaps punishments, sakin mamre, different things. The main mitzvah is referring to certain type of beis din, every generation, certain types of rabbinic legislation, or only the Torah interpretations. That's talking about the main mitzvah, the ikr. But included in that, he wants to say, is that everybody agrees that, just like the Sefer Chana, that there is a general Ratzon Hashem to listen to the Chachamim of not only of the Chazal, but also of every generation, because, as the Sefer Chana explains, it would just be no end. The Torah would become infinite. Okay, I hope that adds some clarity, and hopefully we'll continue listening to the rabbis after all this, and not rebel, as it says. And any last questions? Okay, thank you.